Hi guys, so welcome to part 2 of our presentation on, well, presentational aids. We talked about what presentational aids are, what some visual aids are, different types of them such as objects, graphs, charts, things like that. And now we're going to talk about audio, visual, and other types of aids. So the ones that apply to other senses other than just visual. So, there we go. What are audio aids and how do they help? Well, they help demonstrate how something sounds. So examples are a music clip, a recording of an instrument, or any other situation where you need sound. So let's say that you were trying to demonstrate the difference between a jazz bass and a percussion bass, or between an electric bass and a double bass and upright bass. You might use recordings of those different types of instruments to show how they differ in sound. You could also use pictures of them to show how they differ visually as well, but that would not be an audio aid, it would be a visual aid. So let's say I was giving a presentation on strings on guitars. You can tell I spend a lot of time around musicians. It would be impossible for me to describe how, say, a gut and silk string sounds different from a nylon string on a classical guitar, right? But it would be easy to show with a couple of YouTube clips the differences in nylon strings versus, say, gut or nylon. Or sorry, gut and silk versus nylon. So we might want to use a YouTube clip to demonstrate that, to make it easier for the audience to understand what we're trying to convey. So audio-visual aids combine both audio and visual. So things like videos or PowerPoints with recordings. What I'm doing right now, where I'm talking over a PowerPoint presentation, that is an audio-visual aid, because the visual part is the PowerPoint and me talking is the audio part. So an audio-visual aid is anything that the audience can both hear and see. Some other sensory aids would be things that appeal to other senses. So you might bring in 2 pieces of cloth to demonstrate the difference in texture between wool and silk. Or if you had blind audience members, having Braille might be a way that you could use another type of sensory aid to help those individuals to be able to understand what you're saying or be able to process it. So how do we choose and display our presentational aids? This is a bit of a process, admittedly, but it is super important. So some things that good visual aids will do is they'll illustrate the most important ideas, clarify complex ideas, hopefully simplifying them. They're appropriate for the audience. This means you don't want anything that's going to be offensive to your audience. They'll make information more interesting. They're comfortable for you to use, and they enhance rather than overwhelm. So you don't want a graphic with a million different points of information, or you don't want to use a different font and color for every word, because then that makes it difficult for the audience to process it. And again, you don't want to offend members of your audience. So some guidelines for preparing visual aids is to limit the reading required of the audience. They should be mostly paying attention to you rather than to the aid. So if you're using, say, PowerPoint, you don't want to have a ton of text on every slide. You don't want, entire excerpts of a work unless you're going bit by bit through that work. You can also customize aids from other sources. The internet has a lot of good graphics. Just make sure that you cite your sources when you do that, and explain where you got those from. Otherwise, it's kind of passing it off as your own, and at least for the purposes of education, it's considered plagiarism. You also want to make sure that it's formatted so that it's easy to see or hear. So if you're physically showing it, choose high quality photo prints, use large fonts, make sure your volume is loud enough for the audience to hear. Be consistent with print styles. So choose the same font and, ideally size consistently throughout the presentation. Fancy prints like those scripts or wingdings or things like that, they can be really, really distracting, as can multiple fonts. So you don't want to use either of those too much. You also want it to be aesthetically pleasing. You want to leave enough white space. So white space is the part that doesn't have anything on it. And so if you leave enough white space, it will look more appealing. It'll be easier for the audience to process what's on there. You don't want to overwhelm them with too much. Illustrations also are really good to include. They make your message easier to understand and remember it. Remember, people are much more likely to remember what they see than what they hear, that 80% versus 10% thing we talked about earlier. Use color strategically to emphasize points and add interest. Try to use the same background color for all aids and try to use same color for similarities and different color for differences. If you're making a lot of presentations, it can be a good idea to use kind of branding and be consistent with how your font and your positioning affects your message. You can also use bright colors to highlight information, but you don't want to use more than 3 or 4 colors per aid, because otherwise it becomes too much for the brain to process and it becomes very overwhelming for the audience. Some ways that you can display visual aids are, if you're giving a speech in person, you can do posters, whiteboards, or chalkboards, flip charts, handouts. If you have a computer or a projector, you can also use something like a PowerPoint presentation. You can go online. You can use screencasts. There's a lot of different ways that you can display your visual aids depending on the technical realities of the speech that you're giving. And that brings us to the end of our presentation on, presentational aids. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing your demonstrative speeches where I will want to start seeing these visual aids because it's really important with that type of speech.